Welcome to Globe Z, and today we bring you the book summary of the book, The Afghanistan Papers, A Secret History of the War. The book is written by Craig Whitlock, who is an investigative reporter at the Washington Post. He has covered the global war on terrorism since 2001 and is a 3-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. The book takes a deep dive into the US war in Afghanistan. The US war in Afghanistan started with a seemingly clear-cut mission: destroy all Al-Qaeda and prevent a repeat of September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. 2 decades later, the United States pulled its forces from the battle-scarred country and the Taliban quickly reclaimed power. In this compelling text, journalist Craig Whitlock delves into the disheartening details of the failed war. Whitlock interviewed hundreds of people who fought in Afghanistan and studied thousands of pages of documents. He shows the extent to which Washington, D.C. failed to understand and often lied about the conflict's challenges. I will present the key takeaways of the book now. The easy victory. By quickly ousting the Taliban, the United States seemed to score an easy victory in Afghanistan. Soon after the September 11, 2001 terror attacks, US President George W. Bush ordered American soldiers into Afghanistan. In the early weeks and months, the invasion appeared successful. The Taliban resistance crumbled in just 6 weeks, and US forces suffered minimal casualties. Thousands of American troops streamed into Afghanistan, and just 20 died in the first 6 months of the war. Despite the apparent victory, 7,000 troops remained in Afghanistan after the original incursion. The Bush administration executed a promising start to the war, but no one in Washington, D.C. had a clear plan for how it would end. Wary of Afghanistan's history of entrapping foreign invaders, the Bush administration wanted to put a few US boots on the ground as possible. The early successes soon turned into a quagmire. Bush and his advisors didn't want to abandon a nation with little capacity for self-governance. Yet they also feared that sending too many troops into Afghanistan would leave Washington to shoulder the blame for the woes of a dysfunctional country. One advisor to the Bush administration in White House summed up the conundrum. The United States didn't want to embark on a path of ambitious nation building, but once the Taliban was flushed, we did not want to throw that progress away, the advisor said. The case of overstatements. American officials overstated the magnitude of the initial victory over the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. In 2002, Pentagon officials characterized the situation in Afghanistan as a conflict that was already over. This narrative held that the United States had won decisively, that the Taliban was done, and that Al-Qaeda had been routed. But privately, officers on the ground in Afghanistan told a different story. The Taliban and Al-Qaeda had retreated, but they had hardly surrendered. The shooting match is still very much on, one wrote in a private email. The Taliban proved far more durable than anyone in Washington realized. Moreover, the insurgents seemed to grasp political reality better than the invaders, as one Taliban leader warned the Americans in 2006, "You have all the clocks, but we have all the time." On a broader level, the United States had jumped into a war with only a hazy idea of whom it was fighting, a fundamental blunder from which it would never recover. One Navy SEAL who fought in Afghanistan noted that American military leaders never clearly spelled out the overwhelming strategy of the war on terror. Why did we make the Taliban the enemy when we were attacked by Al-Qaeda? He wondered. American leaders also lacked any understanding of Afghanistan's tangle of tribes and ethnic divisions. The United States had closed its embassy in Kabul in 1989, and American diplomats possessed no particular knowledge of the country. Even so, in late 2001, America had 2 chances to end the conflict, and it botched both. In the first misstep on December 11, US troops heard that someone had spotted Osama bin Laden near Tora Bora. Yet Washington did not act aggressively enough on the intelligence, and bin Laden remained at large for years. The United States also made a crucial mistake in how it acted toward the Taliban, a group with deep and widespread roots in Afghan society. The United States treated the Taliban as terrorists, which ran afoul of the Afghan culture's rules of war. If you lose a war, you admit defeat and reconcile with the winners. America's ignorance of this cultural practice and its decision to deny the Taliban a role in the post-war peace process proved costly. In 2009, with the Obama administration in charge, US commanders persisted in their assumption that most Afghans despised the Taliban. In fact, many Afghans viewed the Taliban as a better choice than the foreign interlopers and their puppet regime in Kabul, the never-ending nation-building effort in Afghanistan. The United States embarked on a disastrous nation-building effort in Afghanistan. At first, the Bush administration was reluctant to get into the business of propping up a country beset by poverty and illiteracy. Bush even promised the American public that nation-building wouldn't happen. Yet from 2001 to 2020, American taxpayers spent $143 billion to rebuild Afghanistan, a sum that exceeded the US investment in Western Europe after World War II. The efforts proved futile. The Bush administration reversed course on nation building after US officials realized the extent of Afghanistan's dysfunction. One thing seemed clear to Washington. The Afghans needed a new system of governance. America pushed for a model that mirrored its own, but Afghans had no tradition of centralized power. Historically, tribes and warlords ran regions within the country. We did not know what we were doing, one State Department official later said. Still, the Bush administration went ahead and ultimately installed Hamid Karzai as the top man in Kabul. Nation building is exactly what the United States tried to do in a war-battered Afghanistan, and on a colossal scale. American officials would point to such things as road construction and voter registration as signs that Afghanistan was becoming a modern nation. Security assistance was the biggest line item, totaling $85 billion over 2 decades. As the insurgents regrouped and fighting resumed, American leaders deflected attention from the military quagmire by pointing to signs of visible progress such as roads, schools, and health clinics. But many such nation-building exercises were boondoggles. In one instance, a US-built police station in a remote province included a glass facade. The local police chief had never used a doorknob and had no idea how to enter his new headquarters. The Americans built new schools next to existing schools. Never mind that Afghan parents refused to send their children to either facility. The United States pumped so much money into building projects that bureaucrats lost track of how much they were spending. An audit of one $2.3 billion program found the Pentagon could supply details for only $890 million of the money it had spent. Losing focus on Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq. Certain that America had secured victory in Afghanistan, the Bush administration turned its attention to Iraq, which required a much larger invasion force of 120,000 troops. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld insisted publicly that major combat in Afghanistan was over. American soldiers on the ground had a much different view. They continued to routinely kill Taliban fighters, yet in his infamous Mission Accomplished speech in 2003, Bush claimed we destroyed the Taliban. With the Pentagon preoccupied by Iraq, the already bloody mission in Afghanistan grew even hazier for units in the field. With Washington's attention now focused elsewhere, American officers in Afghanistan suddenly found themselves struggling to build their forces. The best officers and troops were going to Iraq. One officer griped that when he requested personnel, the Pentagon would send reservists who hadn't fought in years or officers in their 50s. In late 2003, the Taliban re-emerged as a threat, but the Bush administration missed this reality. Acting on the assumption that the Taliban was gone, the United States did not do enough to prop up Afghan security forces. When it realized that the Taliban had regrouped, Washington scrambled to train Afghans. It was no easy task. Many Afghans had no concept of marksmanship. They opened fire without aiming, and many had no experience driving, making them a menace when they got behind the wheels of military vehicles. Discipline was lacking as well. Afghan soldiers routinely disappeared from duty or sold their gear and weapons for extra cash. Years after the United States ousted the Taliban, illiteracy and innumeracy remained rampant, and the quality of recruits into the Afghan security forces was low. Soldiers fighting a war without any information on it. The US military did little to teach frontline soldiers about the nuisances of the Afghan culture. Almost none of the Americans in Afghanistan spoke Dari or Pashto, two of the most common languages in the country. Indeed, much of the cultural instruction offered by the US military was focused on the languages and customs in Iraq, which was a much different place. When one officer reported for training at home before leaving for Afghanistan, his instructor began talking about Iraq. The officer spoke up to say the students were bound for Afghanistan. The instructor's response? Iraq, Afghanistan is the same thing. Few troops possessed even a remote grasp of Afghanistan's history, its religious customs, or tribal dynamics. Meanwhile, most US troops spent just 6 months to a year in Afghanistan and were then replaced by rookies. As a result, few soldiers gained a nuanced understanding of Afghanistan. The policy held for the diplomatic corps at the embassy too. They quickly rotated in and out of Kabul. US and its troublesome relation with Pakistan and the opium crackdown. The United States mishandled both its relationship with Pakistan and its opium crackdown. As the Taliban and Al-Qaeda began regaining power in 2003, they took up residence just across the Pakistani border. Rebel fighters would materialize to engage with US troops and then disappear back across the mountains, 150-mile frontier. The terrain made policing the border difficult, as did the fact that US soldiers were not allowed to enter Pakistan. Pakistani General Pervez Musharraf positioned himself as an ally of the Bush administration, and he received $10 billion in US aid. The White House was slow to realize that Musharraf privately supported the Taliban, even as he publicly allied with Washington. From Musharraf's perspective, playing both sides was smart. He intuited that the Americans would leave someday, but that the Taliban would remain. The Afghan-Pak border, which stretched as far as the distance from Washington DC to Denver, was impossible to seal off. The United States also squandered $9 billion on progress designed to end the Afghan opium trade. Afghanistan's poppy fields provide the raw material for the world's heroin. The United States tried bombing opium facilities from the air and rolling over poppies with tractors. From the media, US officials made a big show of eradicating opium crops. The numbers tell the true story. From 2002 to 2017, opium production nearly tripled, and the amount of land devoted to poppy cultivation quadrupled. The drug trade became a major funding source for the insurgency. All of this was mishandled by the US, or its own generals were in on it on the trade. Winning the war, a case of smoke and mirrors. As the war dragged on, American officials intensified their use of a new tactic, that is lying. By 2007, the insurgents had gained so much momentum that they made an attempt on the life of Vice President Dick Cheney when he visited Bagram Air Base. The suicide bomber missed Cheney, but he did kill 3 US soldiers and 20 Afghan laborers. The Taliban took credit for the attack, a claim an army colonel dubbed absurd, in an attempt to hide the fact that news of Cheney's visit had leaked to the insurgents. Thus began a cycle of American officials lying to the American public about the progress of the war and the capabilities of the enemy. In one dramatic episode in 2009, a defense secretary, Robert Gates, fired Army General David McCreenan, the head of US and NATO forces in Afghanistan. McCreenan's mistake, being honest, he described the conflict as stalemated in southern Afghanistan and a very tough fight in the east. An ethos of careerism soon took hold. Diplomats and military brass realized that giving an honest assessment of the war effort was bad for their careers, so they put an unfailingly optimistic spin on the doomed war effort. What began as selective self-serving disclosures hardened into willful disclosures and eventually flat-out fabrication. Another example of dissembling occurred following Operation Riverdance, a part of the Americans' failed attempt to eradicate Afghanistan's opium trade. During one such initiative, a US plane crashed into a row of homes. American officials admitted to just 2 civilian casualties, but a colonel who was at the scene later recalled recovering the bodies of 15 Afghans. Meanwhile, the State Department lied about the number of poppy plants destroyed during Operation Riverdance, insisting to Congress that the failed mission was a success. In truth, Operation Riverdance helped turn the formerly docile Helmand province into a hotbed for the insurgency. The poppy farmers whose crops the Americans destroyed suddenly had a reason to fight alongside the Taliban. A change in the presidency did not affect the war. A changing of the guard in Washington did little to affect the course of the war. Barack Obama inherited the war when he took office. A new president ultimately decided on a fresh strategy. In a December 2009 speech at West Point, Obama announced he would send 30,000 additional troops to Afghanistan. Obama committed what many considered a blunder. He said the extra surge of troops would last for just 18 months. The top brass was bewildered. Army General David Petraeus said he learned of the public deadline just 2 days before Obama announced it. The Taliban's reaction was obvious. If they could survive for 18 months, the new troops would go home. The Taliban thus patiently waited out the surge. Despite massive investments, Obama's war strategy was failing. US forces killed Osama bin Laden, a major victory in the war on terror. Obama began bringing American soldiers home from Afghanistan, and his military officials offered upbeat pronouncements. But the reality was far more bleak. Afghanistan remained rickety and corrupt. The Taliban was in Pakistan waiting out Obama's 18th month deadline. America had spent untold sums on a war in which no victory was possible. Donald Trump promised to win the war that Obama couldn't. In the end, however, he ordered his State Department and Pentagon to negotiate a troop withdrawal with the Taliban. Trump's successor, Joe Biden, followed through on Trump's plan and ordered a withdrawal of all US troops by September 11, 2021. Conclusions. US had no idea about the war. They had the idea how to go in, but how to go out, it was not properly planned out. US officials did no homework and instead resorted to lying about the victories, which were not even there. US made countless mistakes in Afghanistan, which haunted it for the 20 years and came to bite it back on 15th of August 2021 when the Taliban in a blitzkrieg took over Afghanistan.